The skies above Zerinthia burned with an unnatural fury. The once pristine spires of the royal capital, shimmering like crystal under the twin moons, now lay broken and crumbling, their grandeur reduced to smouldering ruins. The scent of charred stone and burning foliage choked the air, and the cries of the wounded and dying carried on the wind like a mournful dirge. The Kraal dominion had come with fire and steel, and the peaceful world of Zerinthia was helpless before their might. I stood on the high balcony of the royal palace, my heart pounding against my ribs as I watched my home collapse into chaos. Below me, the golden streets of the city ran red with blood, and the beautiful gardens, once full of songbirds and whispering fountains, had been torn apart by the monstrous war machines of our invaders. The Kraal were a race of conquerors, hulking brutes with thick, plated hides and jagged weapons that cut through flesh and stone alike. They did not negotiate, they did not take prisoners. They descended upon worlds like a plague, stripping them of their beauty, their people, their very essence. My father, the king of Zerinthia, had sent emissaries in the desperate hope of peace, but their mutilated bodies had been returned to us as a grim answer. I knew the palace would be next. The royal guards, though brave, were no match for the Kraal. Our people were artists, scholars, and dreamers, not warriors. We had spent centuries shaping our world into something beautiful, believing that peace was the natural order of the universe. How foolish we had been! A deafening explosion shattered the walls of the palace's outer courtyard, sending a spray of marble and glass across the grand hall. Screams echoed through the corridors. I turned, my long ceremonial robes tangling around my legs as I ran. Servants and nobles alike fled in all directions, their elegant silks stained with soot and blood. Princess Aelara, my attendant Ceres, grasped my arm, her hands trembling. "We must get you to safety. The royal family is being evacuated." I hesitated. My father, my mother, my younger brother. Where were they? I had last seen them in the throne room, desperate, figures huddled together as the guards formed a last line of defense around them. I should have been with them. Instead, I had been standing alone, watching my world burn. A monstrous roar echoed through the palace halls, and Ceres screamed as a Kraal warrior burst through the ornate doors. He was enormous, his armor caked with the blood of my people, his yellow eyes gleaming with savage hunger. With a single swipe of his clawed hand, he sent Ceres sprawling to the floor, where she did not move again. The beast turned its gaze upon me. My body refused to move, frozen by fear. This was it. This was how I would die. But then the air itself seemed to split apart. A roar, louder than thunder, erupted from the heavens. It was not the Kraal. It was something else. Something new. A fleet of unfamiliar ships descended from the clouds, their angular forms slicing through the smoke and chaos with terrifying precision. Beams of energy lanced through the Kraal warships, tearing them apart in controlled, strategic strikes. It was not the random destruction of a marauding force. It was calculated, surgical. The Kraal warrior before me snarled, distracted by the sudden turn of events. And in that moment, something changed. My fear did not vanish, but it became something else, something sharper. I turned and ran. I did not know who these new arrivals were. I had heard the stories, the whispered rumors of the Terrans, beings from a distant system who fought with brutality unmatched by any known race. Some called them saviors, others called them monsters. As I sprinted through the shattered halls of my home, I prayed they were the former. Sergeant James Carter had seen war on more planets than he cared to count, but nothing quite like this. Zerinthia had been a paradise, a world of golden cities and pristine skies, of harmony and elegance untouched by the brutal realities of the galaxy. Now it was a graveyard. The Kraal had come like a storm, leaving only ruin in their wake. Carter, gritted his teeth as his dropship shuddered, descending through the smoky clouds above the capital. Through the viewport, he saw the palace, the last stronghold of Zarinthian rule, engulfed in battle. Explosions erupted across its grand courtyards, and towering spires collapsed as Kraal warriors rampaged through the elegant halls. The mission was simple: extract the royal family before the Kraal slaughtered them all. The doors of the dropship hissed open, and Carter leaped out, rifle raised, his boots slamming onto the marble pavement. The rest of his squad followed, moving with disciplined precision. Plasma fire streaked across the palace grounds, illuminating the night as human soldiers clashed with the monstrous Kraal. Their armor was thick, their claws like razors, but Carter had fought worse. The Kraal weren't invincible. They bled just like any other creature if you hit them hard enough. A guttural roar to his left. He turned, squeezing the trigger. A plasma bolt struck a charging Kraal warrior in the chest, sending it crashing to the ground with a smoking hole where its heart had been. "Keep moving," Carter barked, gesturing toward the palace entrance. "We need to get inside before they wipe out the royals." His team moved fast, sweeping through the grand corridors. That had become a war zone. The once beautiful halls were now splattered with blood, and the delicate murals that had likely taken centuries to craft were charred and broken. Carter didn't have time to mourn the loss of art. He focused on the mission. A pair of Zarinthian guards lay dead ahead, their fragile, elegant weapons shattered beside them. Carter crouched beside one, checking for any sign of life. Nothing. They had fought bravely, but never stood a chance. A scream echoed down the corridor, not the guttural, war-hardened cry of a soldier, but something else, a voice full of fear. Carter surged forward, rifle raised, following the sound. He rounded a corner and burst into the throne room. It was a massacre. Kraal bodies littered the floor, but the blood wasn't just theirs. Zarinthian nobles lay sprawled across the marble, their once immaculate robes stained red. At the center of it all, a single figure remained standing. She was tall, her silver-white hair cascading down her back, her violet eyes wide with terror. He had seen images of Zarinthian royalty in the mission briefing. This had to be Princess Aelara, but she was in trouble. A Kraal warlord, larger than the others, stood before her, a jagged blade raised. Aelara was frozen, paralyzed with fear. She wasn't a fighter. Her people had never been warriors. The Kraal knew this. They enjoyed dragging out the kill. Carter didn't give them the chance. One well-placed shot, and the warlord's body jerked backward, a gaping wound in its chest. It staggered, let out a sickening gurgle, and collapsed with a heavy thud. Aelara gasped, stumbling back as Carter strode toward her. She looked at him as if she didn't know whether he had just saved her or doomed her to something worse. He lowered, his weapon slightly, scanning her for injuries. She was shaken but unharmed. That was enough for now. "Princess Aelara?" His voice was firm but not unkind. She flinched at the sound of his words. Her lips parted slightly as though she wanted to speak, but nothing came out. She was overwhelmed, probably in shock. He had seen it before, the look of someone whose world had just been torn apart. "We need to move," he said, softer this time. "More of them are coming." Still, she did not respond. Carter sighed, reaching for his comms. "This is Sergeant Carter. I have the package, requesting immediate extraction." Aelara finally found. Her voice. Who are you?" Carter glanced at her, then at the destruction around them. "Just a soldier," he said. "Now let's go." The palace was collapsing around us. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the acrid stench of burning stone. Explosions shook the ground beneath our feet, and the once grand corridors of the Zarinthian royal palace were now reduced to a battlefield of fire and ruin. The Kraal were relentless, their guttural war cries echoing through the shattered halls as they closed in on us from all sides. Princess Aelara hesitated, her violet eyes flicking between the devastation and me. as if unsure whether to trust me or run. I didn't have time for hesitation. I grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to make it clear. "Move!" I barked. She stiffened at my touch, but she ran. My squad was holding the extraction point just beyond the palace walls, but getting there wouldn't be easy. The Kraal had already breached the inner sanctum, and more of them were pouring in every second. We sprinted down the grand hall, dodging debris and leaping over bodies. Every few steps, I turned to fire a few shots, covering our retreat. Aelara flinched at the sound, but she didn't slow down. A Kraal warrior emerged from a side corridor, raising a jagged, blood-stained blade. I barely had time to react before Aelara did something that surprised me. She ducked. Whether it was instinct or luck, the Kraal's swing missed her by inches. I took the opening and put 3 plasma bolts into its chest. The creature staggered before collapsing in a heap. Aelara looked up at me, breathless, as if she hadn't expected to still be alive. "You all right?" I asked. She nodded quickly, eyes wide, and then we were running again. The sounds of battle grew louder as we neared the palace gates. My comms crackled to life. "Sergeant Carter, we're getting pinned down out here. The Kraal are throwing everything they've got at us. We're almost there." I snapped back. "Hold the line!" The exit was just ahead, an arched gateway that led to the outer courtyard where my squad was waiting. But before we could reach it, a deafening crash shook the ground, and a section of the ceiling collapsed between us and our escape route. Aelara stumbled, falling to her knees as dust and debris filled the air. I reached for her, pulling her up. Just as more Kraal soldiers appeared behind us, we were out of time. I pushed her against the remnants of a fallen column, shielding her with my body as plasma fire erupted around us. The Kraal weren't just trying to kill us, they were trying to make a statement. They wanted the last member of the Zarinthian royal family dead, and they wanted to carve their victory into the ruins of her world. Not happening. I reached for a grenade, primed it, and lobbed it into the advancing horde. The explosion sent Kraal, bodies flying, buying us a few precious seconds. I turned to Aelara. "When I say run, you run. You hear me?" She swallowed hard, but nodded. I took a deep breath, then pivoted, firing into the smoke as I moved. "Go! Now!" Aelara bolted. I kept pace beside her, cutting down any Kraal that got too close. The gateway was just beyond the rubble, and on the other side, I could see my squad laying down, suppressing fire, holding back an entire wave of enemy warriors. "Carter, move your ass!" one of my men yelled. I pushed Aelara forward. She nearly stumbled but kept going, sprinting through the gateway just as a fresh explosion rocked the ground behind us. We broke through into the open courtyard, where our waiting dropship hovered above the battlefield. My squad was dug in, firing from behind makeshift cover as the last line of Kraal pushed forward. Aelara turned, chest heaving, staring at the chaos around her. Her people were dead or dying. Her city was in ruins. This wasn't just an escape, it was an exodus. The end of everything she had ever known. I grabbed her hand again, pulling her toward the ship. "We have to go." For a split second, she resisted. I saw it in her eyes, grief, hesitation, the unbearable weight of leaving her home behind. Then the Kraal broke through. I shoved her up the boarding ramp as gunfire erupted behind me. My squad was already pulling back, covering each other as they sprinted for the ship. The last man barely made it before the ramp sealed shut, and then we were airborne, rising above the inferno that had once been the Zarinthian capital. Aelara stood in the center of the cabin, her breathing ragged. She turned to me, her eyes shimmering with something I couldn't quite place. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's engines. I exhaled, shouldering my rifle. "Yeah, I did." For the first time, she didn't look at me like I was a monster, but she did look at me like I was something she didn't understand. The hum of the dropship's engines was steady, a rhythmic pulse that filled the silence between us. The battle still raged below, But it was already lost. Zerinthia was burning, its golden spires collapsing under the weight of the Kraal's merciless conquest. From the small viewport beside me, I could see the once beautiful capital swallowed by fire and ruin. Princess Aelara stood in the center of the cabin, staring at nothing. She hadn't spoken since we took off. Her hands were clenched into fists, her shoulders stiff, her breathing controlled but shallow. I had seen that look before. It was the expression of someone who had lost everything. I leaned back against the bulkhead, letting my rifle rest against my chest. My squad sat on the opposite side of the cabin, checking their weapons and murmuring amongst themselves, but no one approached her. They knew better. Finally, I broke the silence. "You okay?" Aelara flinched slightly at my voice, as if she had forgotten I was there. Slowly, she turned to face me. Her violet eyes were unreadable. "No," she said. "Fair enough." She swallowed, as if trying to force down the emotions threatening to surface. "My people. My family." Her voice broke. "They're gone." I didn't have anything comforting to say. I wasn't the type. And I wasn't going to lie to her. "I know," I said simply. Her gaze snapped to mine, filled with something sharp. Anger, grief, maybe both. "Do you?" she demanded. "Do you know what it's like to watch your world burn, to hear your people scream for mercy that will never come?" I held her gaze. "Yeah, I do," she blinked, caught off guard. I didn't elaborate. She didn't ask. Silence settled between us again, heavier this time. I could see the tremor in her hands, the way she clenched her jaw to keep it from trembling. She was trying to hold herself together, to keep whatever was left of her composure. I had seen soldiers do the same thing after watching their squad mates die. The mind could only process so much horror before it shut down. I sighed and reached into one of the compartments on my belt. After a second, I pulled out a small canteen and held it out to her. She stared at it. "What is that?" "Water." She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing against mine. She lifted it to her lips and drank, and for a moment the tension in her shoulders eased. "Where are you taking me?" she asked after a long pause. "Back to the fleet," I said. "You're safer with us than anywhere else right now." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Safe," she repeated, the word bitter in her mouth. "There is no safety anymore." I didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. A crackle of static came from my comms. "Carter, report." I pressed a finger to my earpiece. "Extraction successful. Package secured. En route to the fleet." "Copy that. We're getting reports that the Kraal are moving to engage us in orbit. Prepare for turbulence." "Great, just what we needed." I braced myself as the ship jolted, a sudden shift in gravity pulling at my gut. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Enemy warships incoming. We're going to have to punch through their blockade." Aelara's. Hands tightened around the canteen, her knuckles turning white. "We're not safe yet, are we?" I shook my head. "Not even close." The ship banked hard, and outside the viewport, the dark void of space was filled with streaks of light. Plasma. Fire, missiles, the chaotic dance of war. The Kraal weren't going to let us leave without a fight. Aelara took a slow breath, steeling herself. Then, for the first time since I had met her, she looked at me not with fear or grief, but with determination. "Then, we fight," she said. Damn, maybe she had more steel in her than I thought. The ship shuddered violently as the Kraal blockade tightened around us, their warships unleashing a relentless barrage of plasma fire. The artificial gravity struggled to compensate for the sudden maneuvers as our pilot pushed the dropship's engines to their limits, twisting and weaving through the chaos of battle. Princess Aelara gripped the edge of a nearby support beam, her knuckles white. She wasn't used to this kind of turbulence. Her people had never fought wars, never known the desperate, instinct-driven battle for survival that humans had mastered long ago. I stayed on my feet, bracing myself as I moved. Toward the cockpit, tapping my comms. "Command, this is Sergeant Carter. We're caught in heavy fire. Where's our support? The response crackled through the static. Hold position, Carter. Fleet's moving to break their line, but you need to punch through. We can't send fighters without thinning our defenses. Gritted my teeth. Copy that. I turned back to my squad, their faces set in grim determination. We had all been through worse, but this wasn't just another extraction. The Kraal wanted Aelara dead. If we didn't get her out of here, Zorinthia would be nothing but a footnote in history, a world erased, its last heir left to die in the void. The ship lurched again as another blast rocked the hull. Aelara let out a sharp gasp, nearly losing her footing, but I caught her arm before she fell. You all right? I asked. She looked up at me, eyes still wide with fear, but there was something else beneath it, something raw and unyielding. I don't want to die, she whispered. Then don't, I said. Stay on your feet and keep moving. She swallowed hard and nodded. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. Hang on! I'm going to try and push through their formation. The ship tilted sharply, and my stomach twisted as the inertial dampeners struggled to keep up. Through the viewport, I saw the vastness of space streaked with weapons fire. The Kraal blockade was tightening, their warships shifting to cut off our escape. If they boxed us in, we were dead. A warning klaxon blared. Missile lock. Someone shouted. I turned toward the weapons panel. One of my squad mates, Ramirez, was already on it. He slammed his fist against the countermeasures control, releasing a flurry of flares and chaff. The missile veered off course, detonating harmlessly. In the void. That was too damn close, Ramirez muttered. Aelara was staring at the chaos outside, her breathing shallow. She wasn't used to this kind of violence, this kind of raw, unforgiving brutality. Her people had never been fighters, but she was beginning to understand. The Kraal weren't just here to conquer, they were here to exterminate. A moment later, the ship's intercom blared again. Brace yourselves. We're going through the hard way. The engines roared as the dropship surged forward, straight toward the blockade. Plasma fire exploded around us, lighting up the cabin with flashes of red and orange. The shields flickered under the relentless assault, alarms screaming warnings. But we kept going. I grabbed Aelara's arm and pulled her down behind a bulkhead, shielding her with my body as another impact rocked the ship. We're not going to make it, she murmured, her voice barely audible. I looked her dead in the eyes. Yes, we are. She stared at me for a long moment. Then slowly, she nodded. The ship shuddered one final time. Then we were through. The blockade was behind us, and ahead, the lights of the Terran fleet shone like salvation. The enemy fire lessened as human warships engaged the Kraal, drawing them away from our escape route. Aelara let out a shaky breath. Still gripping my arm, I exhaled and tapped my comms. Command, this is Carter. We made it. A pause. Then the voice came through. Roger that. Get the princess aboard the flagship. She's safe now. Safe. Aelara turned toward me. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes shimmered, not just with relief, but something deeper, something that looked suspiciously like gratitude. For the first time since this mission began, I allowed myself a small, tired smile. We're not done yet, Princess, I said. But we're damn close. The tension in the air didn't ease, even as the dropship docked within the massive hangar bay of the TSS Valhalla, the flagship of the Terran fleet. The moment the ramp lowered, medics and security personnel rushed forward, their boots clanking against the metal floor as they prepared to receive us. Princess Aelara hesitated at the threshold, staring at the unfamiliar surroundings. Her home was gone, her people scattered or dead, and now she stood among humans, strangers who had risked their lives to save her, but were still to her an unknown force. Come on, I said, nodding toward the waiting officers. They need to see you're alive. She took a slow breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward. The security officers saluted, and the medics moved in to assess her, scanning for injuries. Aelara stiffened at their touch, but didn't protest. 1. Of the officers, a grizzled commander named Briggs stepped up beside me. He was built like a war machine, broad shoulders, a face lined with old battles, and sharp eyes that took in everything. "Hell of a mission, Carter," he muttered. "We thought you weren't going to make it." "Yeah, well, neither did we." I replied. "What's the situation?" Briggs exhaled. "The Kraal fleet is still hammering us, but we've got reinforcements on the way. We should hold." He nodded toward Aelara. "We need to get her to the war room. Command wants to speak with her immediately." I glanced at the princess. Her composure was remarkable, considering everything she had been through. But I saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of grief pressing against her shoulders. "She needs rest," I said. Briggs snorted. "We don't have time for rest. She's the last heir to Zerinthia. That makes her a political priority." Aelara looked between us, then straightened. "I'll speak with them now." Briggs gave a curt nod. "Good. Follow me." I walked beside her as we moved through the hangar and into the ship's corridors. Soldiers and officers paused to watch her pass, some with curiosity, others with sympathy. News of Zerinthia's fall had spread fast. They knew she had lost everything. The war room was a stark contrast to the devastation she had fled. Holographic. Battle maps flickered in the dim lighting, showing the ongoing fight in orbit. Admirals and commanders stood around a large table, speaking in hushed tones. The moment Aelara stepped inside, the room fell silent. Admiral Rains, the highest-ranking officer in the fleet, studied her with a calculating gaze. "Princess Aelara," he said, "I am deeply sorry for what has happened to your people." Aelara lifted her chin. "The Kraal did this. What I need to know is what you plan to do about it." Rains exchanged a glance with his officers. "We are already engaging their fleet, but the Kraal are relentless. They won't stop with Zerinthia. We believe they are moving to expand their invasion deeper into the sector." Alara's fists tightened. "Then you must stop them." "We will fight," Rains assured her, "but we need more than just military action. We need alliances, resources, and intelligence. The Kraal operate like a plague, moving from world to world. If we don't find a way to cripple them at their core, this war won't end." Aelara's expression hardened. "Then let me help." The room went silent again. Rains raised a brow. "Help? Princess, you have just lost your homeworld. You need time to recover." Aelara shook her head. "Time is a luxury we don't have. If my world is gone, then I will dedicate what remains of me to ensuring the Kraal do not take another." I couldn't help but admire the fire in her voice. She had been a grieving refugee minutes ago, but now she stood with the presence of a queen. Rains considered her for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. We'll discuss how best to use your knowledge of Zerinthian defenses and the Kraal's movements, but for now, get some rest." Aelara hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, Admiral." The meeting ended, and as we stepped out of the war room, she turned to me. "You don't have to stay by my side," she said softly. I crossed my arms. "Yeah, I do." For the first time since we met, she smiled. Just a little. The silence of the ship's corridors was a stark contrast to the chaos we had left behind. Princess Aelara walked beside me, her posture rigid with exhaustion, but she refused to falter. She had barely slept, barely eaten, and yet she carried herself as if she were still standing in the golden halls of her lost palace, still a ruler. Rather than a displaced survivor, I led her to the officers' quarters, where she had been assigned a room. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a simple yet comfortable space, a stark contrast to what she must have been used to. No elaborate tapestries or shining crystal windows, just metal walls and functional furnishings. A bed, a small desk, and a viewport that showed the endless black of space. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room before she exhaled and lowered herself onto the edge of the bed. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to press down on her shoulders. I could see it in the way her fingers dug into the fabric of the mattress, the way she stared at nothing, lost in the wreckage of her thoughts. I hesitated at the doorway. "You should get some rest," I said. She let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Rest," she repeated. "That seems so strange now." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "You've been through. Hell, no one would blame you for needing time to process it." She turned her gaze to me, those violet eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. "Time won't bring my people back. It won't undo what's been done." She shook her head, pressing her lips together. "What if I sleep? And when I wake, I forget the way my home looked, the sound of my mother's voice, the scent of the gardens in the royal courtyard." Her voice cracked on that last word, and for the first time since I met her, she looked truly fragile. I stepped inside and sat in the chair across from her. "You won't forget," I said. "You'll carry it with you. But if you don't take care of yourself, none of it will matter. You want to make sure your people didn't die for nothing? Then you survive. You fight." She studied me for a long moment, as if trying to see the truth behind my words. Then she nodded, though it was a slow, reluctant motion. "You sound as if you speak from experience." I looked away, my jaw tightening. "I do." She didn't press for details. Maybe she saw the ghosts in my own eyes, the weight of battles I had fought and the faces I had lost along the way. A soft chime sounded from the console by the door. A message. I rose and tapped the screen, and Admiral Raines's voice came through. "Sergeant Carter, report to the command deck. The Kraal fleet has begun a retreat, and we need to assess the situation." Aelara straightened. "They're retreating?" He frowned. The Kraal weren't the kind to back down easily. This wasn't mercy, it was strategy. "Looks like it," Raines continued. "Bring the princess with you. If the Kraal are shifting their forces, we need her insight." I glanced at Aelara. "Looks like you're not getting that rest just yet." She stood, squaring her shoulders. Whatever moment of vulnerability she had allowed herself was gone, locked away behind royal composure. "Then let's go," she said. As we stepped into the hallway, she hesitated for just a moment before speaking again. "Thank you, Carter." "For what?" She met my eyes. "For making sure I didn't break." I smirked. "You were never going to break, Princess. You're tougher than you think." She smiled, small but real. Then together we walked toward whatever came next.